Hello, friends. Welcome to Storycraft. On this channel, you will enjoy world-top stories. Let's view the video, The Ant Who Built an Empire. Silently whispers beneath the soil, in the dense, sprawling underbrush of a vast forest. A small, almost imperceptible movement stirred beneath the earth. It wasn't the rustling of a predator, nor the tremor of a storm on the horizon. No, it was something far more patient, far more deliberate. It was the silent work of an ant. Beneath the ground, in the darkness where the roots of towering trees twisted, and the soil was rich with the decay of ages, a hidden empire was beginning to take form. It was a kingdom not of stone or gold, but of tiny grains of sand, leaves, and fragments of broken earth. And in this quiet, unassuming place, the foundations of a grand design were being laid, one minuscule grain at a time. The world above was oblivious to the monumental task unfolding beneath. To the casual observer, the forest was a place of life, of birds calling, of deer grazing, of wind whispering through the leaves. But under the canopy, in the damp earth, a more secretive story was unfolding. And at the heart of this story was an ant, an unremarkable creature in the eyes of many, but one with a vision, a purpose far beyond what any could imagine. The beginning of the trail, it all began with a single thought. No one knew when or how it first emerged, but somewhere in the deepest reaches of the colony, an idea sparked. It was not a loud idea, nor was it born from any extraordinary event. It was subtle, a quiet whisper in the collective consciousness of the ants. The ant that would come to symbolize this quiet revolution wasn't born a leader. It had no crown, no title, no significant heritage. It was just another worker, no different from the thousands around it. But there was something about this particular ant, something in its movement, the way it went about its tasks. It did not hurry like the others. It did not rush to and fro, digging, gathering, and building in the frenzy typical of its kind. Instead, this ant moved with purpose, slow, steady, and observant. It watched the flow of the colony, studying the patterns of behavior, the ebb and flow of its fellow workers. While others carried food and repaired tunnels, this one spent hours beneath the surface, unseen by its peers. It learned the landscape of the earth, understood the subtle shifts in the soil, the currents of air deep below ground. A hidden talent. Unseen, as days passed, the ant began to notice something that others did not. The colony, for all its size and strength, was bound by the limitations of its immediate environment. There was no room for expansion, no avenue to grow beyond the roots of the ancient trees. The ant could sense the strain, the tension that came with the limited space, the overcrowding, the silent discontent. Yet none of its fellow ants seemed to notice. They worked tirelessly, filling their duties with blind obedience. But this ant saw opportunity. It understood that beneath the soil, in the vast unexplored depths, there were untapped resources, vast tunnels to be carved, new chambers to be built, spaces where the colony could thrive without constraint. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about building a future that no one else could see. So, it began to dig, quietly, carefully. It didn't carve the grand tunnels of its peers, nor did it labor to construct expansive chambers. Instead, it worked in small, incremental steps. One grain of soil at a time, it began to expand the boundaries of the colony, creating hidden pathways, unseen routes that would lead to places no one could reach. Each movement was deliberate, each grain placed with intention. The ants' efforts went unnoticed by the colony at large, but that was how it wanted it. The soil whispered, and the earth accepted its touch. The silent work continued. Unseen by all but the soil itself, the tunnels that taught as the days turned into weeks, the tunnels began to expand. They grew like veins, intricate and complex, spreading beneath the earth's surface in patterns that seemed random at first glance, but those who looked closely would begin to see something more, something profound in the design. The ant had not simply dug tunnels for the sake of it. It had woven a network, a map of underground connections that linked every corner of the colony in ways no one could have imagined. And each of these connections was carefully chosen to serve a purpose, to ease the flow of resources, to provide routes that could be traversed in times of need, to create a network of safe havens when the colony would inevitably face danger. These tunnels were more than just passageways. They were symbols of foresight, of planning, of a vision beyond what anyone could see. The colony's workers, blindly following their instincts, would soon find that the paths this ant had created were not just a matter of convenience. They were the foundation of something much larger, the first sign of change. It wasn't long before the other ants began to notice the change. It started subtly, one worker stumbling upon a new tunnel, a fresh passage they hadn't seen before. At first it was dismissed as a fluke, a product of the Earth's natural shifts. But as the days passed, more and more workers found their way into the tunnels. They marveled at the strange, intricate paths that seemed to lead them to new sources of food, to uncharted chambers, to safety when danger loomed. Soon, the whispers of these new tunnels spread through the colony like wildfire. The workers began to speak of the mysterious paths that had appeared, paths that led to places no one had ventured before. Some were skeptical, others curious. But none could deny that these tunnels, these whispers beneath the soil, were beginning to change the way the colony operated. It was as though the earth itself had conspired to give the colony a new beginning. The silent architect. And so, the ant's vision began to take root. In the silence of the underground, the empire was being built, not with the noise of construction, but with the quiet persistence of one worker, one grain at a time. The others would never fully understand the depths of what was happening beneath their feet. They would never know the architect of this quiet revolution. But they would come to rely on it. And over time, the ant's subtle influence would transform the colony into something far greater than it had ever been before. A kingdom built not with grandeur or fanfare, but with the quiet, patient whispers of the soil itself. The weight of a single grain. The colony had always been a place of order, of constant motion. Ants worked tirelessly, each fulfilling their role without question or deviation. They carried food back to the queen, they tended to the larvae, and they dug the tunnels that connected their sprawling underground network. To an outsider, the ant colony might appear to be a well-oiled machine, an intricate dance of countless small bodies, all moving in perfect unison. But beneath the surface of this coordinated hustle, there was something stirring, something that had taken root in the mind of one lone ant, something that would alter the course of the colony forever. This was the moment when the seeds of change began to take hold. And it all began with something deceptively simple: a single grain of soil. A different kind of burden. While the rest of the colony moved at its typical frantic pace, the ant, who had now grown accustomed to its quiet labor, was learning to view the world differently. It no longer rushed to complete its tasks. Instead, it was focused on the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of its world. The other ants, with their heavy loads of food, were always hurrying back to the colony, unaware of the small, delicate work taking place in the shadows. The calm ant, in contrast, was carrying a single grain of soil, a small burden, hardly noticeable to the untrained eye. It wasn't much. In fact, the weight of the grain was so negligible that many would dismiss it as insignificant. Yet to the ant, this tiny grain represented something much larger. It was the beginning of something grand, something monumental. It was the start of a vision, one that could not be realized overnight, but one that required the weight of a single grain at a time. Each grain it carried was like a tiny promise, a small part of a much bigger design. The grain didn't appear to be much on its own, but in the hands of the ant, it was the beginning of a transformation. It was like the first note in a symphony, small, unassuming, but essential to the whole. The long road ahead. The journey of a single grain of soil was long, almost painstakingly so. It wasn't just about moving the grain to its destination. It was about where that grain would go and how it would fit into the grand structure that was being built beneath the earth. The ant didn't mind the effort. It didn't mind the long, winding route. The work wasn't for immediate reward or recognition. It was for the future, for the unseen empire that would one day be. As it trudged along, carefully navigating the tunnels, it passed countless other ants, all of them moving in the opposite direction, carrying their own loads. Some carried leaves, some carried seeds, others moved debris. The colony seemed to move in constant motion, an unbroken chain of laborers, each focused on their individual tasks. But the ant with the grain didn't hurry. It didn't push or shove its way through the throngs of busy workers. It simply moved, step by step, carrying its tiny burden toward its destination. And as it walked, it began to feel a sense of purpose that the others didn't seem to share. The hidden blueprint. Beneath the ground, the tunnels were starting to take shape. At first, the expansion had been subtle, just a few extra chambers here and there, a few unexpected twists in the usual patterns. But as the ant continued its work, the network began to grow. The tunnels were becoming more deliberate, more structured. There was a rhythm to them now, a flow that was unlike anything the colony had known before. The more grains the ant carried, the clearer the vision became. It wasn't just about carving random passageways or digging for the sake of digging. No, this was a blueprint for an empire. Every grain of soil it moved, every inch of tunnel it created, was carefully calculated to serve a purpose. The tunnels were designed to be efficient, to allow the colony to move swiftly and easily. They would be a refuge when danger came. They would be a supply chain that could carry food, water, and resources more quickly than ever before. To the other ants, it was hard to see the grand design taking shape. After all, they were focused on their own duties, their own tasks. They didn't have the time or the perspective, to step back and see what the ant with the grain could see. But the work continued, one small piece at a time. A colony's reluctant acknowledgement. As the days passed, the once quiet work of the solitary ant began to catch the attention of others. At first, there were whispers, hushed conversations between workers who had noticed the new tunnels, the new paths. They would speak of the strange passages that seemed to appear out of nowhere, how they would lead to unexpected places, often to better sources of food or easier routes. They marveled at the efficiency with which the colony seemed to move through the tunnels. But the credit for these new routes was often attributed to something more abstract. Perhaps the soil had shifted on its own, or maybe the Queen had ordered the construction of a new network of tunnels. No one thought to question the source of these changes. No one but the ant knew the true origin of this transformation. Despite the praise the colony heaped on the new structure, the ant with the grain never stopped its work. The praise didn't matter. The recognition didn't matter. What mattered was that the empire was being built, one grain at a time, and that vision was still far from complete. The growing complexity of the empire. With each new grain of soil moved, the network of tunnels expanded. More and more ants began to follow the paths laid out by the quiet architect. The tunnels became more complex, branching out in new directions, forming an underground web of passageways that connected every part of the colony. The empire was no longer just a series of isolated chambers. It was a living, breathing network, designed to function as a single entity. The ant, still toiling in the shadows, was beginning to see the first signs of something remarkable. It had started as a single grain, but now the weight of that grain had multiplied. The work was still far from over, but the foundations had been laid, and the empire was beginning to take shape. The quiet revolution had begun, and the weight of a single grain had turned into something far greater, a foundation for an empire that would one day be a testament to the power of patience, persistence, and quiet determination. The price of progress. But even as the colony thrived, there was a price to pay. The more the tunnels expanded, the more resources were required to maintain them. The ants began to notice that the food stores were running low. The workers, now used to the convenience of the new pathways, were becoming increasingly reliant on them. And yet the food they gathered didn't seem to last as long as it once had. The weight of progress, the weight of each grain moved, was beginning to show. The colony was growing, but with that growth came challenges that had not yet been foreseen. The burden of the empire had become heavier than anyone had expected. And the ant, who had set the wheels of this transformation into motion, knew that the journey was far from complete. March of the Invisible Architect. The colony had started to feel the effects of the changes. What began as a quiet transformation had now grown into something larger, more powerful, more intricate. The once simple tunnels were now a labyrinth beneath the earth, their branches twisting and turning in ways that seemed almost unnatural. It was a maze of passages that few could comprehend, and yet it functioned with a purpose that no one had foreseen. The ants moved more quickly now, their movements becoming swifter as the paths allowed them to navigate more efficiently. They no longer needed to take the long routes to find food or shelter. They could move effortlessly through the underground, world, each worker slipping through the network of tunnels like a shadow in the dark. It was as if the colony had been reborn, a phoenix rising from the ashes of its former self. Yet beneath this newfound speed, there was something still unacknowledged, something that no one had yet realized. The true architect of this sprawling, underground empire was still working, unseen, beneath the surface. The invisible hand that had shaped the colony's fate was working in the shadows, its presence felt but never fully recognized. The reluctance of change. Despite the undeniable improvements in the colony's infrastructure, there was resistance to acknowledging the source of these changes. The ants, focused as they were on their duties, found it difficult to believe that the tunnels, these perfect, efficient pathways, had come into existence through the work of one solitary ant. They had grown used to their work, to the steady rhythm of their lives, and the sudden appearance of these new routes felt almost too perfect to be true. Some workers began to question the sudden convenience of the tunnels. How had they appeared? So quickly? Who had crafted these intricate paths that allowed them to move with such precision? Some ants even whispered about the possibility of an outsider, a foreign creature perhaps, creating these tunnels, infiltrating their world and shaping their environment for unknown purposes. But those whispers were fleeting, quickly dismissed by the greater hive mind. They were silenced by the momentum of the work itself. No one truly questioned the source of the changes, for the colony was moving forward, and progress was undeniable. The invisible architect, the one who had labored in silence, who had borne the weight of each grain of soil, was still toiling away. The ant that had begun this transformation had not stopped its work. It continued to move through the colony's labyrinth, shaping and refining the network of tunnels, one grain at a time. An empire unseen. To the untrained eye, the empire was thriving. The colony was larger, more efficient, and better organized. The workers, once scattered and disorganized, now seemed to move in perfect harmony. There was a grace in the way they navigated the tunnels, a fluidity that spoke of careful design. The ants no longer had to rely on chance or instinct to find food or shelter. Everything they needed was within reach, accessible through the underground web that stretched out beneath their feet. But to the ant that had designed this empire, the work was far from complete. It was as though the work of building a kingdom had only just begun. Every day, it moved through the tunnels, refining the paths, strengthening the chambers, reinforcing the connections. The tunnels had become more than just a means of transport. They had become an extension of the colony itself. They were a living, breathing entity, just as much a part of the colony as the ants who populated it. Yet, despite the expansion, there was an unspoken truth that gnawed at the ant. The work was far from over. Every tunnel that had been dug, every grain that had been moved, was just a small piece of a greater design. There were still spaces to fill, connections to make, and structures to build. The colony's success had been achieved through quiet, patient work, but now it faced the daunting task of maintaining this delicate balance. And no one saw the weight of that responsibility except the invisible architect. The strain of leadership. As the tunnels grew more complex, the demands of leadership began to weigh heavier on the shoulders of the ant. It wasn't just about digging or moving soil anymore. It was about vision, about seeing the future of the colony and knowing how to guide it forward. The ant had to remain one step ahead, constantly adapting to new challenges, constantly refining the plans it had set in motion. It was exhausting. The work, once done with the quiet confidence of an invisible creator, now felt like a burden. The tunnels were no longer just pathways. They were lifelines. Each grain of soil carried with it the weight of an entire colony's survival. The ant could feel the strain in every movement, in every step it took through the ever-expanding network. There were days when it seemed as if the colony might outgrow the tunnels entirely, when the pressure of maintaining such a vast underground empire threatened to collapse the very foundations that had been carefully laid. But the ant never wavered. It continued its work, one grain at a time, determined to ensure that the colony could continue to thrive. The invisible architect remained, steadfast in its mission, an empire at a crossroads. As the colony expanded, it began to encounter new challenges. With the increased size came new risks. The once simple, straightforward tasks of gathering food and protecting the queen had grown more complicated. The tunnels, once perfectly suited to the needs of the colony, now required constant maintenance. There were cracks in the walls of some chambers, some paths that had begun to erode. The delicate network that had been constructed was in danger of falling apart. The ants, working tirelessly to sustain their daily lives, couldn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. They continued on, unaware that the very infrastructure they depended on was beginning to show signs of wear. The invisible architect saw the danger clearly. The work had to continue, but it had to evolve. The tunnels needed to be reinforced. New routes had to be carved, and old paths had to be abandoned before they collapsed entirely. It was at this moment that the invisible architect, for the first time, began to question its own design. Had it done enough? Had it accounted for every possible scenario? Was the colony truly prepared for the challenges that lay ahead? The weight of leadership, of responsibility, now felt heavier than ever. The architect, invisible to all, was grappling with its own limitations. It had built an empire from the ground up, but now it faced the greatest test of all, how to ensure its survival in the face of unforeseen challenges. The hidden genius. Yet, despite these doubts, the architect never ceased its work. It dug deeper, moved more carefully, and thought more strategically. The colony was still thriving, still moving forward, and that was enough. The invisible architect knew that the work would never be finished, that the empire would never be perfect. But that was the beauty of it. It was in the imperfection, in the constant striving, that true greatness was achieved. The architect's work was not about achieving perfection. It was about creating something that could endure, something that could grow and adapt over time. And in that quiet, patient march, the invisible architect was crafting a legacy that would last far longer than any single ant could ever comprehend. The empire was far from complete, but it was alive. Alive with the energy of 1,000 small workers, alive with the potential of every grain moved, every tunnel expanded. And in the quiet shadows, the architect knew that its work had only just begun. When shadows took notice. The empire beneath the earth was thriving, but with its success came a quiet tension. As the tunnels expanded and the colony flourished, there were whispers in the darkness, whispers that spoke of things beyond the colony's control. The unseen architect, still working tirelessly in the shadows, felt the change. The balance that had been so carefully crafted was beginning to shift. The colony had grown too large to remain unnoticed. What had started as a humble network of tunnels had now become a sprawling underground kingdom. Its reach extended far beneath the roots of the great trees into the very heart of the forest. The once silent work of the invisible architect had built something formidable, something resilient. But this growth had also drawn attention, both from within the colony and from forces outside its walls. A kingdom unseen. As the ants continued to move through the tunnels, they began to feel a change in the air. The passageways, once quiet and efficient, now seemed to hum with a new energy. There was a vibration in the soil that the ants had never felt before. It was as though something was stirring, something waiting just beneath the surface. At first the workers thought nothing of it. They were busy, as always, gathering food, reinforcing the tunnels and attending to the queen. But there was an unsettling feeling in the air, a sense that something was watching, something was aware of the empire being built beneath the earth. And yet, the source of this feeling remained elusive. The architect, however, was not so unaware. It had sensed the shift long before the others did. It had felt the weight of the world above pressing down, felt the stirring of something beyond. Its control. There were forces in the forest, predators, rival colonies, and even the elements themselves that could threaten the empire the ant had worked so hard to build. The first signs of danger. It wasn't long before the first signs of danger began to appear. The workers in the tunnels began to encounter new obstacles. Predators that had learned of the colony's existence, other creatures whose paths crossed with the tunnels. The earth, which had once felt like a safe haven, began to show signs of disturbance. Small cracks appeared in the walls of the tunnels, and the vibrations that once felt like progress now seemed like the warning tremors of something greater. The ants had always been prepared for danger. They had built their tunnels with care, creating safe chambers, escape routes, and hidden refuges. But this was different. The danger they now faced was not something they could easily predict or control. It wasn't an external force that could be repelled by sheer numbers or force. It was something that moved in the shadows, something that understood the colony's structure in ways the ants themselves could not. As the tension grew, the architect, still hidden in the deepest recesses of the tunnels, began to take action. The work that had once felt like an organic growth now had to become a careful, strategic defense. The invisible architect began to reinforce the tunnels, fortifying weak points, closing off vulnerable areas. Every grain of soil moved now had a new purpose: to protect, to shield, and to secure the colony's future. The hidden threats. Lurking. The first real threat to the colony came from below. Deep in the earth, there were creatures that the ants had never encountered, burrowing. Predators that could collapse tunnels with ease, creatures whose movements could cause landslides and fractures in the soil. These creatures, invisible to the workers above, had long been living in the dark, beneath the roots of trees and beneath the very soil the ants called home. One by one, the ants in the colony began to vanish. At first it was just a few workers, here and there, those who ventured too far into uncharted tunnels, those who found themselves caught in the unstable earth. But soon, the disappearances became more frequent. Entire chambers were abandoned, and paths that had once been bustling with activity became silent. The ants began to feel the weight of the threat bearing down on them. The once efficient network of tunnels was now becoming a labyrinth of uncertainty. Each turn, each corner hiding potential danger. The predators that had remained unseen for so long were now taking their toll, and the ants were beginning to realize that they were no longer the only ones in control of the underground. The Invisible Architect's Dilemma. As the colony's leadership grappled with the new danger, the Invisible Architect felt the full weight of its responsibility. It had built the empire to be a sanctuary, a place where the ants could thrive without the fear of external threats. But now, the very foundation it had created was being tested. The tunnels, once a symbol of progress, now felt like a trap, an intricate web that had become more of a prison than a refuge. The architect knew that the time had come for action. It couldn't simply reinforce the tunnels any longer. It couldn't rely solely on the work it had done in the past. The empire had to evolve. The once hidden chambers, the secret passageways, would no longer be enough. The ants had to adapt to survive. But even as the architect worked to fortify the colony, doubts began to creep in. Was it too late? Had the empire already grown too large, too complex, to withstand the forces now pressing against it? Could the ants' underground world, which had once felt like a safe haven, really endure the threats that now loomed? The call for leadership. As the threats mounted, the need for leadership became ever clearer. The Queen, though revered by the colony, was not a strategist. Her role was to nurture, to give birth to the next generation of ants, to ensure the survival of the colony in the long term. But now, the colony needed more than just reproduction. It needed a leader who could see beyond the immediate and understand the complexity of the challenges at hand. The ants, sensing the growing pressure, began to look to the one ant who had been shaping their world in silence. The Invisible Architect, still hidden beneath the surface, had become the true leader of the colony. The architect's actions, though unseen, were the backbone of the empire's success. It was the one who had the vision to build the empire, and now it had to have the vision to save it. The Queen, too, felt the strain. While she had always trusted in the architect's work, she was increasingly concerned about the toll that the constant construction was taking on the colony. More and more workers were disappearing into the depths of the earth, working tirelessly without rest. The demands of building the empire were starting to take a physical and emotional toll on the colony's morale. The question of leadership was beginning to arise. Who was truly in charge? Was it the Queen, who had given birth to the colony and nurtured it from the beginning? Or was it the architect, the unseen force that had shaped the very foundation of their world? As the tensions between the visible and invisible forces in the colony grew, the lines between them began to blur. The architect, always aware of its role, did not seek recognition. It did not desire the praise or the acknowledgement of its work. But it was becoming clear that the time for subtlety had passed. If the empire was to survive, The architect would have to take a more active role in uniting the colony, convincing them that the changes, the risks, the sacrifices were all part of a larger, necessary plan. A unified empire. The decision to reveal the architect's full vision to the colony changed everything. The workers, once reluctant, began to see the purpose behind the changes. They understood that survival was not just about maintaining the status quo. It was about evolving, adapting, and growing stronger. The tension that had once divided them began to fade, replaced by a collective sense of purpose. The empire, once a quiet and fragile entity, had grown into something far more powerful. The ants, united under the silent architect's vision, understood that they were not just surviving. They were building something that would endure, something that would last for generations to come. And with that understanding, the empire was no longer just an underground world. It was a testament to the power of vision, unity, and silent strength. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Storycraft for more interesting videos.